If I might plunge right into our topic for the evening, as you know, at the Republican convention, the issue of extremism was raised. How would you define extremism?
The burden of definition rests on those who introduced that word. The trouble with the word is precisely that it has no definition, that none has been given and none can be given. Therefore, if you want my general definition, I would say it is a smear tag. It is a term introduced exclusively for purposes of smearing and is being used as such.
That's philosopher Ayn Rand in a 1964 radio interview. She's commenting on a cultural trend that was represented in the rhetoric, the language, used in the 1964 Republican National Convention. It was a contentious convention where Republicans divided into two camps, one calling themselves moderates, who put forth Governor Nelson Rockefeller from New York as their preferred candidate, and accused those of supporting the presumptive nominee, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, of being extremists. Although Ayn Rand, a principled advocate for laissez-faire capitalism, was neither a conservative nor a liberal, she did support Goldwater for a time, saying that even though he was an advocate for a mixed economy, that he was at least for less government controls, or probably the best candidate we could do at the time, in other words, a step in the right direction. Though she thought his campaign degenerated over time and eventually ended in disgrace. Rand saw something disturbing in the attack of the so-called Republican moderates on Goldwater supporters. It was their use of the word extremism to smear their opponents. And even the use of the term moderate to describe themselves, she thought, was problematic. Let's let Rand elaborate a little more.
Supposing someone like myself is an extreme advocate of freedom, what would my extremism consist of? That I would not compromise on the principles of freedom, that in all political issues I would be on the side defending individual rights and individual freedom. Now, someone who believes in totalitarian statism, in dictatorship, his extremism would consist of taking every possible action to enslave people, to use force, to violate individual rights. Now, would it be logical to say that he and I are equally to be condemned merely because we each take an extreme, uncompromising stand on our particular views? Obviously, the term would have no meaning. You couldn't say that in political action you must never take an extreme position. It depends what position you're taking. And what one would have to support or condemn is the nature of the position, not the degree of your devotion or of your consistency to a given position. Yet that is what the term would imply in politics. It is consistency that is here being attacked. Any kind of consistency will be considered extreme. Yet can you really consider consistency undesirable or immoral?
Islamic extremism, extremist activism, extreme genetic engineering, the extreme right wing, the extreme left wing. Extremism was a term originated in a political context, but 50 years later, the term has spread from its original breeding ground and has latched itself onto many other issues and debates. The term had an unanticipated widespread appeal. Well, at least most people wouldn't have predicted it. Extremism is an example of what Ayn Rand called an anti-concept. She argued that these anti-concepts are nefarious, like antimatter of the mind. They obliterate your ability to think clearly about an issue, and they're used purposefully to that end. Anti-concepts are used by those who want to shut down thoughtful discussion, and by adopting them and using them without question, you are accepting a faulty tool that could actually harm your ability to think. This time on Rise and Fall, the anti-concept, and we'll look at three: extremism, Islamophobia, and meritocracy. Let's begin by continuing our discussion of extremism. Scanning the headlines, instances of the term extremism are everywhere. The UK government is determining whether or not anti-fracking activists should be considered extremists, according to an article in The Guardian. A journalist in the Crimea has been charged with the crime of extremism by the Russian government for questioning the propriety of the Russian annexation of Crimea, according to a Fox News article. Even if Trump loses, his candidacy has emboldened extremist supporters, reads a New York Times headline. Regardless of the issues, it appears that the term is used to discredit particular positions. But can you really condemn a position because it is extreme?
Do you think that the term can ever be used validly?
No. Do you want me to tell you the reason?
Could you?
Now, observe what is the exact dictionary meaning of the term. There is no such word as extremism, but there is such a word as extreme. And the dictionary definition states that extreme means a great or unusual degree of some quality, or a characteristic farthest removed from the average or the ordinary. Now, this clearly indicates that extreme is a term referring to measurement. It is an issue of measurement, of degree. Therefore, you cannot use the word extreme with moral connotations. You cannot claim that an extreme is either good or bad. You cannot use it as a term of opprobrium, as a derogatory term, because measurement as such has no value significance. It can acquire it only from the nature of that which you measure. And it is an absurdity to claim that an extreme degree of anything, regardless of its nature, is evil.
The Republicans at that 1964 convention who railed against extremism began calling themselves moderates. But Rand points out that this is also a term that muddles thinking.
Could you tell me what a moderate is?
No, and neither could they, and that is the reason for that name. You see, the modern attempt is always to introduce tags, labels, smear words into our language which have no precise definition. What is a moderate? Again, moderate, like extreme, is a term denoting measurements. And moderation cannot be a virtue per se, because moderation means what? A lukewarm, middle of the road, half-hearted, or compromising attitude. Therefore, moderation in regard to principles, particularly moral or political principle, is a vice, not a virtue. Now, moderation in one's diet may be a virtue, but that is not what's at stake here. Therefore, today, when people call themselves moderates, ask yourself, moderate about what? Since the basic issue today is freedom versus statism, individual rights or government controls. To be a moderate means that you advocate moderate amount of controls, moderate amount of injustice, moderate amount of infringement of individual rights. Now, surely nobody would call that a virtue.
What Ayn Rand is saying is that in the debate of freedom versus statism, if you take the idea of being a moderate as a virtue, you're condoning the violation of people's rights. In other words, to couch the debate in terms of moderate and extremist is to take freedom off the table, and to instead to make the debate a discussion about how many controls we should have. You're signaling that on the principle of freedom, you view compromise as a virtue.
It is consistency that is here being attacked. Any kind of consistency will be considered extreme. Yet, can you really consider consistency undesirable or immoral?
When it comes to morality, Rand, in her essay on which this interview is based, Extremism, or the Art of Smearing, points out that consistency in regard to morality, it's a virtue. It's part of what it means to say that a person is virtuous, that he is honest or has integrity, for example. You couldn't say that a man of moderate integrity or moderate honesty is really what is to be desired. Extremism, then, doesn't just smear principled champions of freedom, it smears anyone who takes a principled stand on any moral issue. One of the problems with anti-concepts is that they obscure a real issue that needs to be discussed, and they're meant to do that. Here's a modern example: Islamic extremism. The use of the term Islamic extremism is a cause for debate, according to an NPR article. President Obama was criticized for refusing to use the phrase to refer to Islamic totalitarians, while Senator Ted Cruz advocated for the use of the term. The article ends by quoting an expert in Homeland Security who says that in one instance, that even though the term Islamic extremism wasn't being used, quote, everyone understands what kind of extremism we're talking about, unquote. But do we? The big problem with the term extremism is that it obscures an issue that needs to be talked about, but nobody seems willing to address. Philosopher Onkar Ghate, in a 2015 lecture titled Charlie Hebdo, the West, and the Need to Ridicule Religion, explains.
Moderate Muslim and moderate Christian and extreme Muslim and extreme Christian. I don't think you should use that terminology. First of all, it's not clear what it means. I mean, that kind of terminology comes from the anti-concept of extremism. What is it that this access that we've got a moderate and an extreme amount of? It's not clear. I mean, and the unclarity is deliberate. And then it is, well, but we know that going to extremes is bad. So yeah, I guess an extreme Muslim and an extreme Christian, that's bad. And we know that moderation is good. Whatever the issue, whatever the subject, whatever the principles involved, going to an extreme is bad, being in the middle, in a compromised, pragmatic position, that is the good. But a moderate Christian or a moderate Muslim still goes by faith. And now they're immune from criticism. Indeed, they're not just immune from criticism, they're extolled as well. This is what we need. And then you get things, well, we need more moderate Muslims. And where are the moderate Muslims denouncing the attacks on the cartoonist? And, well, what we need is another fatwa. Where are the fatwas from the moderate Muslims denouncing the beheading of journalists and so on? And that, I mean, first of all, you can find such fatwas. And second, the idea that what we need is more fatwas is not a good idea. But that is part of what is wrong with the conceptualization of it. The moderates are part of the problem, not part of the solution. They're part of the problem in that by them legitimatizing, giving legitimacy, that it is okay in some kind of way to base your life and actions on faith, that gives support, sanction, and legitimacy to faith as such. And you can bet, and if you've ever watched or read some of the ways that the recruiters recruit the Islamic totalitarians and the zealots to their cause, they play on this issue. Well, I mean, they tell you, the so-called moderates, they tell you to have some faith in your life and to go by it. And we're saying, yeah, faith is good. You should do it all the time as a way of life. This is what should guide you. This is what we do. Come join us. And in a lot of their minds, yeah, I mean, this is a weak, compromised position. And that looks, I mean, if faith is good, that looks like where I should be. When you get someone to view his whole life as it should be governed by faith, you can get them to do almost anything and support almost anything. So that even though there has to be some focus on what Islam today is about and what it is conveying and what it is trying to indoctrinate, the essence of the issue remains faith, and the argument has to be made, I think, at the level of faith. And the conceptualization in terms of moderate and extreme Muslim, Christian, Jew obscures that issue and is meant, I think, to obscure that issue and has to be resisted.
In that same talk, Gate discusses the Charlie Hebdo massacre, where Islamic totalitarians broke into the offices of French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo and slaughtered writers and cartoonists and anyone in their way. Gate says that thoughtful discussion of that attack, including the role of religion that was played in the lives of the terrorists, is obscured by anti-concepts, and in particular, the anti-concept Islamophobia.
And if you had to just take one, the crucial one that has made discussion of this issue virtually impossible, it's the term Islamophobia or Islamophobic. That term is an anti-concept that has been deliberately originated to make discussion of the issue impossible.
Anti-concepts are constructed in a certain way, according to Rand. They're what's known as conceptual package deals. Like a package deal that you'd get at a store, which is a deal where two or more items are packaged together, making it impossible to get one without also getting the other. Ayn Rand used the term as applied to concepts, where two or more ideas that don't go together are put together under the heading of a single word. For example, in the case of extremism, Lumped together are consistent advocates of freedom or laissez-faire capitalism and consistent advocates of statism. And these two groups, people have only something superficial in common. They don't go together. Gate explains what goes into the package deal of Islamophobia.
So to get and to start discussing the issue of Islamophobia, you have to get everything that is put into the package. And you need to help people distinguish the elements of the package and that they don't belong together. One should not have the same view or evaluation of these things. And there's at least this much in the package, which is made up examples of discrimination against Muslims, which is really bad to make that up. There is incredible irrational treatment of them and attacks on them, or people thought to be Muslims, which is really bad. And then there's informed, thoughtful criticism of Islam as a faith, of its leaders and priests and clerics, and of its practitioners and followers. The kind of criticism that a Sam Harris or an Ayaan Hirsi Ali makes. And they're regularly and usually immediately denounced when they start talking as, well, that's Islamophobic and you're just an Islamophobe. Those are three things put into this category that do not at all belong together. You should not have the same evaluation of, and you need to help people see that this is what the term is doing. And you need to help them oppose the term. And then one way to sort of start the conversation, now sometimes this might end the conversation, but if you get someone who you actually think can think about it, is, look, I find the term Islamophobia offensive. And then start to explain why and what it would mean to really think about this issue instead of trying to silence the issue with a smear.
Steve Simpson, Director of Legal Studies at the Ayn Rand Institute, notes how a New York Times editorial that came out after an attack by Islamic totalitarians in Garland, Texas, at a Draw Muhammad cartoon contest, used the word Islamophobia to obscure discussion. Here he is in a 2015 lecture on freedom of speech.
The New York Times' reaction to the Garland shootings. And I think this is really the worst example. And again, I would urge you all to read this editorial, the editorial that came down, if you can stand to read this, right after the Garland attacks, because it's really an amazing, amazing and sickening example of not only blaming the victim, but a kind of mindlessness, a kind of an effort to obscure rather than enlighten, an effort to befuddle people or cover up what's really going on here rather than to think through. So let me read you an excerpt of this. Here's what the New York Times said, referring to the actual murderers. Those two men were would-be murderers, but their thwarted attack or the murderous rampage of the Charlie Hebdo killers or even the greater threat posed by the barbaric killers of the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda cannot justify blatantly Islamophobic provocations like the Garland event. These can serve only to exacerbate tensions and give extremists more fuel. So the idea conveyed here is, well, of course the extremists are attacking us because of provocations like the Garland event, but further, recognize what this ignores for a moment. This is against the context in which 9/11 happened, in which the London attacks happened, the Madrid attacks, the Mumbai shootings, right? This is after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. It's after Salman Rushdie. It's after the Copenhagen attacks. And it's after years, literally years, of Islamic terrorists attacking Westerners for criticizing their religion. And the New York Times, in one fell swoop, blots all of that out and calls this an Islamophobic provocation, as though that context matters not one whit. The New York Times writes this execrable editorial in the face of all of this. And notice that the purpose of this is to prevent us from really evaluating or thinking about this issue. We are essentially told, ignore all of this context and just treat this as it's just Islamophobic provocations, which ultimately does what? It blames the victims for all of the violence that Islam causes and create, or that Islamic terrorists do.
Next, meritocracy.
I think most people grasp onto a word like meritocracy because they think, hey, I'm just trying to highlight the fact that in a free society, the best rise to the top. What they don't realize is that ocracy, the last digits, this means rule by, it means control by, and it's used to point to examples of allegedly people dictating to us from a position of power. And it's saying that the people who do rise through merit are little dictators. And so the people who use this to praise a free market are really undermining a free market by saying it's no different than any other political system in which we have to take orders from others.
That's Ayn Rand Institute fellow Don Watkins. He's co-author of the book titled Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality. In that book, he points out a disturbing trend in how Americans more and more are viewing the successful artists, businessmen, and inventors, the ones who bring products and innovations to us, as not deserving of their success and wealth, but as the merely lucky who need to be cut down in the name of justice. I wanted to ask him about the term meritocracy because it touches on subjects he's written extensively about. What does it mean to earn something in a free market? And what does a person's success imply, if anything, about their political status? He views the term meritocracy as a word that blurs an important distinction, the line between political power and economic power. Here's more from our conversation. All right, so Ayn Rand wrote meritocracy she said it's an old anti-concept and a contemptible package deal. So I want to get into that, but so first, how old are we talking?
Well, the word is typically credited to Michael Young in his 1958 book, The Rise of Meritocracy. And there were scattered usages before, but he certainly popularized it. And what he was really referring to mainly was this transition that was occurring in Britain from social status being determined by your birth to social status being determined by merit. And more specifically, his real focus was on British political leaders and civil service workers, and the way in which education and testing, rather than the accident of who your parents were, decided who gained power. But now, importantly, he also applied the term to business and to people who achieved economic success through production and trade. And in both cases, he regarded the rise of what he called a meritocracy as at best a mixed blessing, since in his view it exacerbated inequality. It gave those with political and economic power a sense of moral superiority, and then it supposedly made life worse for those at the bottom of society.
So this term has had long-lasting appeal. I've certainly heard it used today. How have you heard it used recently?
Well, certainly the place where I think it's most prominent and you most hear it is in the inequality debate. And what you often hear is that supporters of free markets, supporters of capitalism, will say this is a system of meritocracy, that the best, the most able, the most productive rise to the top. And the opponents say, no, that's not true. The best don't rise to the top. The most advantaged, the most lucky rise to the top. And that even if the most able did rise to the top, that would be a bad thing, since in fact merit is a myth. That what it really reflects in the end is privilege and advantages that some young people have and that others lack.
And so what would they say we're supposed to do about that?
Well, in the end, it's that you chop down the people at the top and you prop up the people at the bottom. It's that if you have a tyranny of merit, then you have to reward people for lacking merit. And merit can mean anything here. They lack an education, they lack money, they lack a pedigree, they lack anything. And so it's not really about lifting up people at the bottom. It's really about bringing down people at the top, including people who've earned their way to the top and don't have political power, but just have success.
But isn't that true to some extent, that the opportunities you had as a child, where you were born, who your parents were, that those do have something to do with the success that you achieve as an adult?
Well, I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask, what does it mean to merit something? What does that even mean? And I'd say that to merit something is to gain it deservingly. And for instance, if I get an A in a test because I studied and I learned the material, I've earned the A. I've achieved it through merit. But if I get an A because I peeked over your shoulder and copied off your test, A, good for you for getting an A, and B, bad for me because I didn't actually deserve the grade. So when we're talking about merit, we always have to be clear on the standard that we're using to assess whether a person deserves what he's gained or not. And what the kind of people who point to lucky events are really doing is they're using an irrational standard of desert. The kind of quintessential example that we're given of people like Bill Gates, the argument is basically you can't say Bill Gates succeeded through merit because he would have had to have been fully responsible for everything that went into creating Microsoft. But he wasn't. They'll point out that he had access to computers when very few other people did. And that wasn't something that he created. He lucked into it. And so we can't say that a person like Bill Gates, or indeed any of us, merits our success, since many factors that went into our success were not within our control. But that is not a rational standard of desert, because what it effectively demands is omnipotence. In reality, we're never fully responsible for everything that goes into our achievements because at minimum, and this is something the egalitarians never tire of pointing out, we don't choose our parents. Then the conclusion is no one does deserve anything. But what that really means then is that there's no difference between Bill Gates' success or Bernie Madoff's. They're both equally undeserving because neither was fully responsible for his own success. It completely ignores the choices that led to one's success, or at least in Madoff's case, apparent success. And so the real issue is whether Bill Gates' success resulted from his making good choices to learn, to think, to work hard, to produce a superior product that millions of people willingly paid for. When he could have made bad choices, right? He could have taken it easy. He could have lived off his affluent parents, or he could have went and tried to get a favor from the government. So when we're thinking of desert, in other words, the rational policy is not asking whether a person would have achieved what he did under different circumstances. Would Bill Gates have created Microsoft if he hadn't had access to computers when he was younger? What we're asking is whether his achievements followed from good or bad choices given the actual circumstances he faced. Did he create Microsoft, or did he, like thousands of other people in similar situations, do something that did not result in an enormously successful company that changed the way we live and we work?
So tell me more about the word then, meritocracy. So what is that? What is it trying to describe or obliterate, or what's going on with that word?
Well, the dictionary definition of meritocracy is holding power by people selected on the basis of their ability, or a ruling or influential class of educated or skilled people. And so what you see being blended together are two very different things. One is mind and one is force, or one is economic power and the other is political power. So
it sounds like it's really important to draw a line between political power and economic power. What's the line that's drawn there? Or why isn't it the case? Is it the case that people who have a lot of money and influence, like Bill Gates, also have political power?
This has always been central to the attacks on capitalism, the equation of economic and political power. And there are certain reasons why people find that plausible. So if you think about before capitalism, you had a system of aristocracy. And there you did have a unification of political and economic power. It's that the people with political power owned the economy. They were able to exploit the people who worked for them. And so, if you saw riches, you inevitably saw somebody who had the power of the gun, who could force people, who could exploit people, who could take advantage of people. Capitalism, though, broke those two apart to the extent that we had capitalism. Now you saw fortunes arising not through force and compulsion. You saw it arising through production and voluntary trade. Andrew Carnegie had one of the greatest fortunes in history, and it wasn't that he was holding up with anybody up with a gun. It's that he was creating steel that was cheaper than ever in history and allowing us to build railroads across an entire continent and skyscrapers from the floor of New York. But the more that you have government involved in the economy, the more then that you do make it possible for some people to grow rich through political power. And so you can think of the whole phenomenon of cronyism, where I can get a special grant from the government that comes at the expense of my competitors. I can get a subsidy that comes in at the expense of taxpayers. I can buy political power, but the problem is not that I'm rich and can buy it. The problem is that the government is selling it. The government is selling the ability to exploit others through the political system. That's what capitalism denies. But the deeper issue here is, can we inherently equate economic and political power? And the way that we're taught to think about it is think of how people like Carnegie were characterized. They were characterized as robber barons. They were explicitly trying to say that they were no different from the barons of the medieval age. And you always have to keep in mind that there's a fundamental difference between what somebody like Carnegie can do on a free market, which is offer people rewards that they can accept or go their own way, versus political power, which is the negative. It's the capacity of somebody to say, my way or else. Once economic power is the ability to offer rewards or not, and political power is the power to deprive people of what's rightfully theirs. And so you can't ever treat those two as the same. You can't treat as the same somebody who can offer you a job or not, and somebody who can prevent you from taking a job that you want to take.
But meritocracy tries to obliterate the distinction between those two.
Exactly. It says that we're no longer thinking about whether a person has economic or political power. We're asking that they have power over others. How did they get it? Did they get it through the random twist of fate, or through the fact that they happen to be good at tests and went to Harvard or Yale? That's the wrong way to view things, and yet that's exactly what's being injected by this anti-concept of meritocracy.
Today we've addressed 3 anti-concepts, but there'll always be more, used to obscure, silence, and smear. Here's a little advice from Don Watkins about the importance of choosing your words carefully, especially as tools of thinking.
Well, concepts are tools, and so I like to think about tools the same way that, a Marine would planning to march into battle. That is, you have to think really carefully about what you pack, and you're only going to bring with you the tools that help advance your mission. And yeah, it's disastrous if you brought something that actively undermines your mission. Like, here's my tracker that's going to allow the enemy to follow my position. You definitely don't want to do that, but that's not even what you're focused on. What you're focused on is the positive. Whenever you're going to embrace this tool, this word, you're going to ask, does this tool advance my mission? And you're going to be thinking carefully about that. And if it doesn't, then it's going to stay at home. And that has to be your policy with words, with the concepts that you use. So, from Ayn Rand's perspective, whenever you use a word in your thinking, you're making a real commitment. You're saying, I'm going to view the world from this perspective. And so you want to make damn sure that that's the right way to view the world. And I think when most people adopt concepts like meritocratic, they're doing so really without thinking about it, without taking seriously that they're making a commitment. And so you need to be asking with any word you use, particularly a new word or an unfamiliar word or a word that you're picking up that somebody else is using. You need to ask, what is this clarifying? How is this advancing my mission of governing my way through the world? To change the metaphor a little bit, if you think about life as you're traveling through a dark room, your mind is what is going to be the flashlight, and the flashlight is really the concepts that you use, and they can either illuminate, in which case you can govern your way through the world effectively, or they can just be kind of a crummy flashlight that you half sort of are able to stumble around and get from point A to point B. And that's the equivalent of just latching onto words that are perfectly good words, but you haven't really thought through how they advance your understanding of the world. But if you're on the premise of just accepting words without thought, then you're prone to accept an anti-concept. And that is the equivalent of not just having a bad flashlight, but of taking LSD. You are going to completely subvert your ability to get from where you are to where you want to go because you're not seeing things as they are. And so at the end of the day, our words are our most precious tools. They're tools for thinking. And so we need to treat as a sacred undertaking which tools we're going to adopt and which we're going to recognize as dangerous weapons that could blow up in our faces.
And finally, here's Ayn Rand back in 1964, advising on how to stand up for oneself when confronted with people using smear terms like extremism.
The best, first and basic defense is never to use undefined terms, never to give currency, nor to enter into debates about such issues as extremism. The basic defense is to define one's terms very clearly and never to sanction any undefined package deals, never to sanction smear labels. What I would like to suggest, since we can't cover the issue exhaustively here, I would like all those interested to read an article of mine on this subject, an article entitled Extremism or the Art of Smearing, because there I cover every aspect of this issue, including the epistemological methods which make the spread of smear words possible. Therefore, anyone who would like to protect himself against an unwitting sanction of his own enemies, I would recommend to him to please read that article for your own self-protection.
You can find that essay at aynrand.org. You've been listening to Rise and Fall, How Ideas Move the World. This podcast was produced by me, Amanda Maxim, and the Ayn Rand Institute. Music was by Poddington Bear.